Hey patrons, welcome back to the third part of this tutorial series, and in this final part we're going to be working on adding all of the details for the background, all of the stems and the flowers, and we're going to be using whitewash to add some highlights and details, and we're just basically going to be adding all of the final details to this painting. So I'm going to start off by painting in some of the stems, some of the green stems that we can add flowers on top of. So I've just mixed up some green and put a bit of brown and Payne's Grey into it. And I'm going to start off by looking at the reference image and just basically loosely painting in where I want some of these stems to be. And you can see that I'm just doing curvy lines. I'm not doing them too straight. I'm trying to add a bit of curve to them, so they look a little more natural. And I'm also adding little tiny lines coming off the top, because as you can see in the reference, the stem has lots of different sort of branches coming off it, with lots of different flowers stemming from one of the stems. So I'm just going to loosely keep painting in the stalks for the flowers, making sure that I keep splitting each one off into little bits. And I'm looking and following along with the reference to see which direction they're going in, how they're curving, how they're leaning. There's a lot more of these on the left hand side than on the right, so I am going to be building up a lot more of these over on this side. And I am using the reference as a reference, but I'm not getting in all of the stems that I can see. I'm just getting the general idea of where there are the most of these stems, which direction are they leaning in, how do they like branch out, and how do they split off with the stalks. But I'm not going to follow the reference exactly, I'm just using it to get a general idea. Like I said, for this colour I mixed up green, I mixed in some brown and some Payne's Grey as well to give it a darker look. So this process will take me a little bit of time, and I am just repeating the same process. You can see that I'm topping off the stalks as well by sort of fanning the top bit out and adding a little bit of detail at the top by dabbing my brush onto the end, to like stippling it to give it more of like some like dots at the top of the stalk. I'm also trying to end the stalks where the pink sort of blooms are, because that's where the flowers are going to be. So I'm drawing and painting the stalks coming from underneath those pink areas, the pink blooms that we got in the first part of this series. So if you're unsure where to paint your stalks, then you can always have them coming up to the bottom of the pink blooms of paint that we've added in, and you can see how nice that salt has worked, and it's created a really beautiful effect. So I'm continuing to split off the main stalk into lots of little bits to give it a fuller look. Make sure you're doing your lines a little bit jagged and jerky so it is a bit more natural looking. I'm doing some of my stalks slightly thicker to add more variety. Try and add a bit of variety to your stalks. Have some of them branching off more, have some of them thicker, some thinner. Like I said, this process is going to take a while, and I am just going to go throughout the whole of the background and just do this throughout the whole of the background. There's not really much else I can say. That's what I mean. You can see I'm tapping on my brush to create the little dots at the end of each of the stalks. There is quite a few of these little stalks and stems behind the deer, so I am going to be adding some more behind the body of the deer as well. Like I said, I'm just going to continue to do this for the next sort of 10 minutes. I'm going to repeat the same process, the same technique, not doing anything differently, just using the same paint and just painting all of these in like I have with the ones I've already showed you. And then I will be back to talk you guys through the next step. Now I'm going to start to go in with a bit more diluted green paint, and I am just going to use that to create some more subtle stems and stalks. So I added some water to the green, and I'm just creating a few lines so that we have variety. Some of the stalks are a bit more subtle. And the next thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to go in and mix up some of the pink paint. I'm just adding a few green splatters to further up on the background. But I am going to mix up some pink paint now. And I'm going to start to define and add more detail to the pink flowers. So if you're finished adding all of your stalks and the stems and working on that part, then you can go and start to mix up some brighter pink. So I'm mixing that onto my palette. The same pink as before. Just getting quite a lot onto my palette and mixing in a little bit of purple, just like we did in the first part. Now I'm going to look at the reference and identify where all of these little pink flowers are, and I'm just going to start to very loosely get them in, as you can see by doing that tapping motion with this small round paintbrush. And I'm just targeting these pink flowers at the top of the stalks that we just painted in. You can see that I am just tapping the pink paint on top in like a stippling motion. The stippling motion helps to create little gaps, so it's not just one solid blob of pink. There's little tiny bits of the underneath layers peeping through. And I am just going to do this on top of each of the stalks that I've just painted in. And anywhere in the reference where I can see the pink flowers as well. Like I am going to be adding some of the pink flowers further towards the front of the painting, for the bits of grass and wheat in the front. And remember, we don't want to completely cover up our salt effect. So I'm not just going to paint over all of it. I am going to let those bigger pink sort of blooms stay there. I'm not going to make my flowers that big. I'm just going to add a few little smaller details with this pink paint at the end of each of the little stalks, as you can see. But we still want the salt effect to show through on some of the areas. So make sure you're not covering up all of the areas with this pink paint. So just repeat that tapping motion on the end of each of the stems. Also, remember that you do need to remove the salt before you go in and paint over the top of the background. So if you haven't already, wait for this to dry and then just wipe off the salt. So once again, I'm just going to continue for the next 5 minutes to go in and just top all of these stalks with some beautiful pink flowers, just using this tapping motion. And then once again, I'll be back to talk you through the next part. There just really isn't that much to say for these stages because it's just repeating the same thing for a long time. I'm not changing the paint I'm using or my technique. I'm just doing the same thing for a long period of time. Now that I've added all of the pink to the flowers, I decided that towards the front of the painting, I want this to be a bit softer and blurrier, because you can see in the reference that the front portion of the tall grass is very soft and blurred out, whereas in As it's still very much in focus. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm just adding lots of clean water to the area that I want to lighten up, just using my larger round brush. And then I'm going over the top of that with the tissue, and this will help lift some of the watercolour. And you can see that already that's a bit softer and it's already a little bit lighter now. And so I'm just going to repeat that process for all of the areas that I want to make a little more out of focus. So just work that clean water throughout the whole of the area that you want to lighten up and make more out of focus. So I'm doing it for the whole front portion. And this will reactivate those previous layers of watercolour a little bit, which will make them easier to remove. So just keep going over it. Then you can go in with your clean tissue and just remove and soften that paint. And already you can see that that is lighter, it's more out of focus. Just going in with more tissue. So now I want to add a little more water over on the left hand side. I wanted to bring the out of focus look a little bit higher up. So I'm just wetting that area. And once again, using my tissue to help soften everything out and lift up the paint. And we will be tapping in some more watercolours in that area in a second. I just wanted to sort of lighten up that area and blur it all out a little bit. Once again, you can choose whether you want to do this or not. You might have liked it how it was before. So I am going to go in and tapping some more watercolours. I just want to keep it very loose and out of focus. So I am tapping in some darker greens, especially over on that left hand side. So I'm tapping in the darker greens. Now I want to mix up a more shadowed colour, so I'm adding in my green, my Payne's grey. I'm going to start to tap this on the shadowed areas of the left hand side, of the lower left hand side corner. And because the paper's still wet, it will bleed out quite softly. Just a little bit of tissue on the paper. So I'm just going to continue to build up the shadows within this corner and for that lower portion that I have just lightened up. But the difference is these shadows and these details are going to be more bled out, so it's going to give more of an out of focus look. The next thing that I'm going to do is start to build up some of the highlights. So I'm going to be using my white gouache for this, and I'm going to be using the Winsor & Newton Permanent White Designer's Gouache. And so I'm just putting a bit of that onto my palette. Just adding a little bit of water to the gouache. And what I'm going to be doing with this is starting to add some highlights, so to the brightest area of the deer, also using it to create some nice splatters, so to create a cool, interesting effect to the background. And we're also going to be using it to add highlights to the flowers and to add some of the taller highlighted bits of wheat as well. So like I said, I'm first taking the gouache and I'm working it through the deer, and I'm looking at the reference and identifying the brightest areas on the reference for the deer. And most of the lightest areas are on the left hand side of the deer's head and neck, because that is where the light is coming from. I'm also using it to add a brighter highlight inside the eye. And so this can be used to cover up any area where you've got a bit too much watercolour on a highlight, if you've darkened it up too much and you want to brighten up the area. The more water you add to gouache, the more translucent the result will be. So for example, if you just want to lighten something up a little bit, if it's got too dark but you don't want to make it really bright white, then you can mix in more water and it will dry more transparent. Whereas if you have hardly any water, your gouache is going to be more opaque. So I just added a few details to the ear, adding a couple of highlights to the nose, and also adding a few little details on the neck to give the look of fur texture. Also adding that highlight to the back of the deer as well. So the deer hasn't really got too many bright highlights on it, but I am going to be going and adding a few highlights to the background to brighten up some of those flowers, to add more contrast. So with contrast, you not only need to get your shadows dark enough, but you also need to have a couple of bright highlights as well. I'm also going to go in and paint in a few of the little tall bits of grass and wheat. I'm looking at the reference to see where the lightest blades of wheat are, what direction they're going in, how are they leaning, all of that sort of thing. How long are they? I'm also going to add a little bit of highlight to the top of the deer, the top of the deer's body, because that is where the light is also hitting. I'm also adding a couple of splatters. Now I'm also tapping in some white gouache into the background to create the look of a few highlighted flowers. The gouache has got a bit of water mixed in, so this isn't going to be fully opaque. It's just to brighten up a couple of these areas a little bit more. Just around the pink flowers. Just want to give it more of a sparkly effect. I'm now going to start to add the bits of wheat that are going over onto the deer. So I'm just painting them over the top of the deer. It's important to try and do these with a nice clean stroke. Keep it very smooth, otherwise they'll look very jagged. You can see that I'm overlapping the bits of grass to give it more of a natural look. And like I said, these will dry a little more subtle than they look when they're wet. So we want to make it look like the deer is within this tall grass and the tall crop. So we want to paint the crop over the top of the deer so it looks like it's actually within this area, in the surrounding. You can also see that with some of the crops I am painting in the general stalk and then feathering it out at the top to create the look of the wheat coming off. Doing that once again. And so I'm just going to continue for the next couple of minutes to paint in even more of this crop using the whitewash. Also, remember that if a highlight is a little too subtle when it's dried and you don't feel that it's bright enough, you can always go in with more gouache and just add a second layer and go over the top to brighten it up even more. So don't worry if the highlight is too subtle and you did mix in a bit too much water with your gouache. You can always just go back in with more gouache and just make it a bit more opaque. I'm also going to build up a couple more highlights on the deer's head. As you can see, I'm creating some tiny fur strokes to add a bit more of a furry texture to the deer. You can see that I also added a little bit of gouache to outline the edge of the right ear. Just lining the side of the nose as well. I'm just going to add a few more little fur details with my brush, just to add more of a textured look to the painting. Once again, just going over some of these bits of crop just to brighten them up even more, using my finger to help blend over it to give a smoother look, a smoother, more out of focus look. Tapping in a little more highlight into the background to create some highlighted bits of blossom and flowers. Brightening up a bit of the crop that's going over the deer. So you can see that I have got a little bit of variety within my crop. Some is a bit more subtle and then some bits are slightly brighter. Just going to add a few more bits of crop. Now once I've added in my highlights with my gouache, you can now go and fix any of the shadows that you need to and just add any final little details. For example, I go in and add some more splatters. I'm just adding a bit more dark green in between some of the flowers just to add a little more depth by darkening up a few little areas, a few shadows. Especially on the left hand side, just working the paint in between the highlights. So this is the time just to observe your painting, see if you want to tweak anything. I will be going in and adding lots of splatters using the white gouache, but for now I just want to make sure that I'm happy with all of the watercolours. So have you got enough pink flowers in? Are you happy with your shadows? Do you need to add some more green stems? Are you happy with the deer? Is there any highlights or shadows you need to add to the deer? Is there any more splatters you want to add with the watercolours to the background? Like I'm doing now, I'm adding some more pink splatters to add more texture and interesting effects to the background. I'm also adding a little bit of white gouache to the background just to highlight a few areas. Using very diluted gouache, but just making some areas a little bit brighter. Once again, just to give more contrast. Because I felt that apart from around the deer's head, a lot of everything else is just quite yellow. So you can go in with a little bit of gouache just to brighten up a few other areas of the background. You can also glaze over the white crop that you've painted in with a little bit of a golden tone to make it slightly more yellow hued, if you want to. So I'm just going to continue to add a few more details with the white gouache. So now I'm going to start to go in and add some of the white twinkly bits to the background, some white splatters. So I'm loading my brush up with white gouache and I'm just simply tapping the back of that paintbrush to give some cool splatter effects to the background and all around the painting. The bigger paintbrush you use, the bigger your splatters are going to be. So if you want tiny splatters, then use a small round brush. But if you want really large droplets, then you can use a bigger paintbrush. Just adding a few more details to the ear of the deer. You can see that I'm painting in the individual fur strokes to give a look of furry texture to the ear. Creating some more highlights on the nose. So I've nearly finished this painting. I'm just going to finish it off with a few more splatters using the white gouache into the background and just all around the painting. I also want to brighten up a few bits of crop as well. So you can see that I'm just going over a few of the bits of crop just to make them a little more opaque. So now that I've brightened up some of those crops with more of the gouache, I'm also just going in with that darker green paint, and I'm just using that to add a few more stems to the background as well. You may not need to do this, you may already have enough stalks painted in, but I just want to add a couple more to the right hand side because I didn't really feel like there was enough there, especially compared to the left hand side. Because as we can see in the reference, on the right hand side, right over on the right hand side, there is that small cluster of stalks, which I just wanted to get in a little bit more. So I'm just using the paint that we already had from before. And I'm just going to use the same process to go in and build up some more of the stalks. So like I was saying, take this time to see if you need to tweak anything. Do you need to add any more flowers with the pink paint? Do you need to add any more green stems? Any more highlights? So just spend the next couple of minutes just looking at the reference and looking at your painting and seeing if there's anything that you want to change. But anyway guys, this is the finished painting. I really hope you enjoyed following along to this tutorial series. I'd love to see the painting that you created if you followed along with this. So remember, you can post a photo of your painting on the community tab and I'd love to see what you guys created. Thank you for joining me for this. I'd love to know what you learned from this tutorial series as well. So this is the final painting and I'll see you guys in the next tutorial series. Bye everybody.